Empire placed all its hopes on the seasoned commander Romanos. Yet his crushing defeat and capture at Manzikert marked the dawn of a new era of turmoil. That very same year, Byzantium lost its final foothold in southern Italy to the Normans under Robert Guiscard, leaving the empire hemmed in by enemies on every side. Amid this chaos rose a figure determined to safeguard the crumbling state at any cost: Alexios Komnenos. This is the tale of the turbulent years leading up to the First Crusade, a period often overlooked. Welcome to our account of the Battle of Kalavrye. After Romanos' failure against Alp Arslan, the empire was spared total ruin by surprisingly generous terms and still commanded a large, disciplined, and well-equipped army. Yet the court in Constantinople spurned those terms and instead plunged into a brief but ruinous civil war against Romanos himself. His stepson Michael VII emerged as emperor, but real authority slipped into the hands of competing aristocratic families, each scheming for titles and influence while the empire itself decayed. Michael soon earned the infamous nickname Parapenakes, minus a quarter, after he debased the gold solidus to just 58% purity, replacing the rest with silver and copper. This debasement crippled the currency's purchasing power and further destabilized the economy. When the emperor raised taxes on top of this, unrest flared almost instantly across the Balkans. Contemporary sources portray the 21-year-old ruler as a puppet of whichever court faction happened to dominate, a monarch more interested in hunting and feasts than in governance. The Balkans erupted in rebellion in 1072, when Bulgarian insurgents, supported by Serbia, put forward Constantine Bodan as their pretender. He seized Skopje, routed the local strategos, and quickly captured Niš and Ohrid before imperial forces could react. The uprising was eventually crushed at Kastoria, but not until 1073, costing the empire precious time and tying down much of its professional Tagmata army in the region. This delay made a full-scale eastern counteroffensive impossible. Instead, the empire dispatched a smaller force under Alexios Komnenos and his younger brother Alexios, commanding only a fraction of the troops Romanos had fielded 2 years before. Alongside them rode 400 Frankish mercenary cavalry under the Norman adventurer Roussel de Bayeul, a veteran of Manzikert. By this stage, the Seljuks had already shattered Byzantine defenses in Anatolia and roamed freely across the plateau. Still, the fortified coastlines and walled cities remained secure, so the region was not yet lost. This expedition therefore aimed to reassert imperial dominance and remind the nomads that Byzantium was far from finished. The army assembled near Caesarea, but tensions quickly surfaced. When Isaac punished a Frankish soldier, Roussel took offense and, under cover of night, withdrew his entire contingent. Isaac considered sending Alexios to bring them back, but before he could act, reports arrived of a Seljuk army approaching. The two forces clashed in Cappadocia. A failed ambush ended in disaster. Isaac was wounded and captured, while Alexios only narrowly escaped. Many Byzantine survivors were turned away from nearby cities, whose garrisons feared the Seljuks were in pursuit. Meanwhile, Roussel struck out on his own. Defeating another band of nomads, he seized the town of Ancyra, proclaimed himself prince, and established an independent domain. News of this stunned Constantinople, prompting Michael to dispatch his uncle John Ducas at the head of a formidable 12,000-strong force, including fresh recruits, veterans of Manzikert, 1,500 Varangians, and 500 Franks. When word reached Roussel that imperial troops had crossed the Bosphorus, he gathered a smaller yet formidable force of 3,000 men, most of them hardened knights. The two armies finally faced off on the 10th of May, 1074 at the bridge over the Sangarios River, near Amorium, Roussel's stronghold. The Byzantines offered him amnesty if he submitted, but he refused. John Ducas, inexperienced and impatient, decided not to wait for reinforcements from nearby cities. Instead, he rashly ordered an attack across the river, putting his men in a perilous position with water to their backs and Normans in front. The imperial host was arranged in 3 divisions across 2 lines. The right flank was commanded by Frankish mercenaries. John Ducas himself held the center with the Varangians, while his son Andronikos commanded the left. The rear guard, made up of levies, was placed under Nikephoros Botaneiates, governor of the Anatolic theme. At dawn, Roussel rode boldly toward the Frankish line and urged them to defect. And they did. United with their Norman brethren, they surged into the Byzantine center. For a time, the Varangians and Normans clashed in brutal hand-to-hand fighting, but panic soon spread. Botaneiates abandoned the battlefield with half the army, retreating to his estates. Seeing this, many soldiers surrendered or fled, and the battle was lost. Both John Ducas and his son Andronikos were taken prisoner. A bitter irony, since only 3 years earlier, Andronikos himself had abandoned Romanos at Manzikert while commanding the rearguard. A new force was hastily raised under Constantine Ducas, another son of John. But he died soon after crossing into Asia Minor. His army disbanded in chaos, plunging the empire further into debt. Roussel then gambled even higher. He declared the captured John Ducas emperor, hoping to legitimize his rebellion. Meanwhile, a figure who would become central to our story was preparing to seize his own chance. After losing his bid for the Seljuk throne to Alp Arslan, Suleiman and his brothers had taken refuge in the Taurus Mountains back in 1064. By surviving repeated punitive raids, Suleiman alone endured. With Melikshah now ruling the Seljuk Empire from Isfahan, Suleiman was able to carve out a base of power in Anatolia, a land whose climate mirrored the steppes but lay beyond Seljuk control. Here, his nomads raided but also traded with local Byzantines, who in turn had grown isolated from Constantinople. And now Suleiman was offered a tempting deal. He would gain formal recognition of his conquests, riches, and imperial friendship, all if he could deal with the troublesome Norman who had just plundered Chrysopolis, within sight of the capital. Roussel's luck finally ran out. He was caught by a Seljuk feigned retreat and taken prisoner. Before Constantinople could pay his ransom, however, his wife arrived with gold and secured his release. Desperation gripped Emperor Michael, who then turned to Georgia. Through his wife Maria, he persuaded King George II to guard the eastern frontier and capture Roussel in exchange for ceding Theodosiopolis, Tau, and Kars. The Byzantines handed over these vital fortresses, but the Georgian army failed, with many defecting to Roussel instead. The empire seemed on the brink. If Roussel was not neutralized soon, rebellion could erupt across the provinces in John Ducas's name. In this desperate hour, Alexios Komnenos stepped forward. Only 20 years old, energetic and shrewd, he was named commander-in-chief and sent against Roussel, without funds and with barely any army. But Alexios relied not on strength, but cunning. He struck a bargain with the Seljuks, promising them riches if they delivered Roussel. Once again, the nomad succeeded, luring the Norman to a feast before betraying him. Roussel was imprisoned at Amasya, yet Alexios faced a new problem. He had no money to pay the Seljuks. To buy time, he deceived the locals by blindfolding Roussel and announcing he had been blinded, unfit to lead or defend them. This trick turned the townsfolk against their once favored protector. With their support, Alexios raised the funds, paid the Seljuks, and returned to Constantinople in triumph. Roussel was thrown into a dungeon in 1076. While Byzantium wrestled with its internal troubles, the West was also in upheaval. In 1076, simmering tensions between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV exploded into open conflict, remembered as the Investiture controversy. The boundaries between papal and imperial authority had always been blurred. Yet Gregory, ambitious and reform-minded, sought to expand papal power like never before. He introduced reforms such as mandatory clerical celibacy, and even envisioned a standing papal army. At times, he spoke of leading an expedition into Al-Andalus, at other times of marching east to assist the Romans in reclaiming their lost lands, though only if they recognized the supremacy of the Catholic Church. He even imagined Christian armies seizing the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Though such ideas sound strikingly familiar now, in the 11th century, they were revolutionary. A pope commanding armies was almost unthinkable. Yet the seeds of the future Crusades were already being sown, a mix of Byzantine desperation for Western aid and the papacy's hunger for greater authority. Papal agents spread word across Europe, exaggerating tales of barbarian atrocities against pilgrims. In reality, thousands of Christians had safely journeyed to Jerusalem since the Muslim conquest centuries earlier. Traditionally, most pilgrims traveled by sea, embarking from ports like Venice and reaching the Holy Land in about 2 weeks. But Arab piracy made this voyage increasingly dangerous, pushing many to take the land route through Constantinople, following Roman roads and enjoying local hospitality. Even this became hazardous as the Normans, Seljuks, and general instability spread across the region. Yet the time was not quite ripe for crusade. It would take a different pope and a different emperor in Constantinople for those ideas to truly converge. Meanwhile, within Byzantium, the reliance on payments and bribes as a solution to every crisis only grew. Alliances were purchased with gold, Hungary was courted, and even the Normans were paid off. Robert Guiscard himself received a fortune, along with 40 imperial titles to distribute as salaries to his men, and his daughter was betrothed to the emperor's son, all in an effort to maintain at least nominal control of southern Italy and buy time for recovery. To fund these deals, Michael VII's government centralized the grain trade. Until then, farmers sold their harvests to merchants, who in turn sold it competitively to the populace. But tax evasion had become rampant. The new system required all grain to be sold at redestus, where fixed prices made taxation easier. The unintended result was disastrous. Farmers withheld grain to create shortages, driving prices up. Constantinople, already swollen with refugees from Anatolia, starved. Riots broke out, though Michael managed to suppress them. But unrest spiraled into full-scale civil war. Not a duel between two claimants, but a chaos of 4 simultaneous rebellions, each with its own ambitions. First was First Bryennios, who had carved out a domain around Antioch after Manzikert. He proclaimed himself emperor and expanded by seizing neighboring Roman cities. Second, a federation of cities along the Danube broke away and allied with the nomadic Pechenegs. In November 1077, Nikephoros Bryennios, governor of Dyrrhachion and one of the empire's most capable generals, also declared himself emperor, gathering a formidable coalition of veterans in the Balkans. And finally, in October 1078, Nikephoros Botaneiates, the 76-year-old governor of the Anatolia theme, raised his own rebellion. With few troops and no strong credentials, he seemed the least threatening. Yet his decision to hire Seljuk mercenaries tipped the balance. After taking Nicaea, he stationed them as garrisons in western Anatolia, including Pergamon, Ephesus, and Sardis, strongholds these nomads could never have seized alone. He assumed that when the time came, he could simply order them to leave. In Constantinople, the aristocracy knew it had to choose a side. Rather than selecting a candidate on merit, they backed whichever ruler they believed would be easiest to control. The capital revolted, forcing Michael VII to abdicate. Botaneiates was invited to ascend the throne, which he did as Nikephoros III. The new emperor secured his rule by marrying Maria, Michael's widow, on condition that her son Constantine Ducas remain heir to the throne. Nikephoros then distributed lavish gifts and titles, forgave debts, and expanded privileges to win support. He even offered Bryennios the prestigious title of Caesar, second only to the emperor himself, but Bryennios refused. By contrast, Bryennios accepted imperial authority in exchange for control of his Antiochene territories, stretching across Antioch, Melitene, and Edessa. Yet rebellion still burned. Bryennios continued his march, seizing much of the Balkans, and Nikephoros III had little choice but to entrust command to a promising young general, Alexios Komnenos. It was the year 1078, and Alexios marched west at the head of an army numbering between 5,000 and 10,000. Among them were 2,000 Seljuk cavalry, 2,000 Chomatonoi elite infantry, several hundred Frankish knights, a newly formed regiment of Athanatoi, the Immortals, and the remainder made up of levies, hastily raised from the provinces. His opponent, Nikephoros Bryennios, commanded the stronger force, 12,000 seasoned warriors, including remnants of the imperial tagmata, Slavic troops, Pecheneg auxiliaries, and contingents of Frankish mercenaries. Bryennios himself was not only more experienced than Alexios, but also a proven commander. Alexios set his camp on the banks of a small stream near the fortress of Kalavrye. He deliberately left it unfortified, projecting confidence. Seljuk scouts were dispatched to locate the rebel host, but several were captured, exposing Alexios' position. Bryennios, knowing he outnumbered his rival, advanced to force a decisive battle. On the day of battle, Alexios formed his lines. He took command of the left wing with his immortals. The center was held by Frankish mercenaries. On the right, Constantine Katakalon led the Chomatanoi and Seljuks. An additional group of Turks was placed on the extreme right to counter the enemy Pechenegs, while another small detachment lay hidden in a hollow on the far left, ready to spring an ambush. Bryennios arranged his army in 3 divisions, each deployed in 2 lines. On his left, 4,000 troops from Thrace and Macedonia. On his right, 5,000 men bolstered by Frankish knights and Thessalian cavalry under his brother John. And in the center, 4,000 soldiers under his own command. His far left was protected by Pecheneg horsemen. As the rebel force advanced, Alexios unleashed his ambush. His immortals charged John's powerful right wing, while the concealed detachment struck from the flank, rushing forward with fierce war cries. The rebel wing faltered under sudden pressure, but Bryennios quickly rallied his men. Cutting down an enemy with his sword, he restored their resolve and held the line. Despite his leadership, Alexios soon saw his own soldiers begin to break. He himself fought in the thick of the melee, slashing with his blade, but could not prevent his men from fleeing under pressure. On the right, the Pechenegs evaded the Seljuk riders and overwhelmed Katakalon's position. In the center, Bryennios persuaded the Franks to desert mid-battle, pledging fealty to him instead. The loyalist army collapsed. With defeat imminent, Alexios gathered only 6 companions and made a desperate charge into the enemy ranks, hoping to strike down Bryennios himself and end the rebellion with one blow. At that very moment, fortune intervened. The Pechenegs, instead of pressing their advantage, abandoned the fight and turned to plunder the rebel camp. As they looted, chaos spread through Bryennios' army. Some soldiers celebrated, others fled, and the lines fell into disorder. Amid the confusion, Alexios spotted the emperor's purple-clothed horse, adorned with the twin swords of state. He cut through retainers, seized the animal, and rode back to his shattered armor. Brandishing the imperial horse, he spread the rumor that Bryennios was dead. Morale revived just as a fresh contingent of Seljuk horse archers arrived at the camp, ready to strike. Alexios reformed his battered army into 3 parts once more. 2 lay in ambush, while the third, composed of Seljuks and immortals, prepared to execute a daring feigned retreat, one of the hardest maneuvers in warfare. The nomads advanced first, loosing arrows in scattered volleys that harassed and disrupted the rebel formations. Then, heavy cavalry charged. In the melee, a rebel rider spotted Bryennios and hurled his spear at him. According to the Alexiad, Bryennios reacted instantly. He drew his sword, cut the spear in 2 before it struck home, and in the same motion cleaved through his assailant's arm and breastplate. Alexios then gave the signal. His cavalry pretended to flee. Bryennios' veterans eagerly pursued, only to be struck by the ambush. From all sides, mounted archers burst forth, showering the rebels with arrows and filling the air with terrifying war cries. The din and confusion shattered their will. Exhausted and encircled, Bryennios' army broke. The battle was won. The rebel leader was blinded, but later pardoned, allowed to retire to Adrianople. Alexios, however, was not permitted to return triumphantly to the capital. Instead, he was sent north against another pretender, Nikephoros Bryennios, who had risen in Thessaloniki. A single night attack scattered Bryennios' followers, ending that rebellion as well. On April 1st, 1081, Alexios and his supporters marched into Constantinople. Nikephoros III was forced to abdicate, and the 24-year-old Alexios was crowned emperor. His rise marked the dawn of the Komnenian dynasty, one of the most pivotal in Byzantine history. But the new emperor had no time to celebrate. Even as he donned the purple robes, Robert Guiscard was advancing. Later that same year, at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, the Normans dealt Byzantium a devastating defeat, shattering its armies. The empire once again seemed on the edge of collapse, yet fortune intervened. In 1085, Robert Guiscard, the tireless architect of the Norman invasion, died suddenly of malaria while campaigning in Cephalonia. His death left the Norman threat leaderless and disorganized, giving Alexios the breathing space he so desperately needed. Still, peace remained elusive. While the West quieted, Suleiman and the Sultanate of Rum were consolidating their hold on Asia Minor, the empire's most vital provinces, once the source of its revenues and armies, were now firmly under Turkish control. Alexios found himself trapped between the loss of the East and the scars of war in the West. To survive, he would need every ounce of cunning, every alliance, and every stratagem at his disposal. In desperation, Alexios began to send appeals for aid to the West, pleas which, when combined with papal ambitions, would set into motion the First Crusade, a storm that would reshape the medieval world. And so, from the ashes of Manzikert and the chaos of civil wars, Alexios Komnenos rose to guide Byzantium into its next great chapter, one of peril, but also of revival. That concludes this episode. If you enjoyed the story of Alexios' rise and the trials of Byzantium, don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter in this saga.